15 of the highest-paid financial experts in Chicago stared at the same encrypted ledger for 9 straight hours, and not one of them could explain where $40 million had quietly vanished. But Delia Hale, a 27-year-old widow in a gray janitor's uniform, found the answer in under a minute while emptying the trash, never realizing that Julian Thorne, the cold and ruthless 37-year-old crime lord who owned the building and everyone in it, was watching her every move from the shadows of the doorway. She was nobody to them, a tired woman with calloused hands, scrubbing floors at midnight to pay off her dead husband's hospital bills and care for a mother-in-law who didn't even remember her name anymore. He was a man who'd buried his own father, outlived his brother's betrayal, and hadn't trusted a living soul in years. She didn't know who he really was, and that was exactly why she wasn't afraid to speak the truth no one else dared to. And what this dangerous, lonely king of the underworld chose to do next, instead of making her disappear like every other person who'd ever seen too much, would leave even his most loyal men speechless. If you believe everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's get back to the woman with the mop who outsmarted a room full of geniuses. The 40th floor of Thorne Tower was drowned in the pale blue glow of computer screens at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, when Delia Hale pushed her squeaking cleaning cart into the glass conference room that the people from earlier had just left behind, leaving in their wake cups of cold coffee, scattered papers, and the sour smell of helpless sweat. She let out a soft sigh and muttered to herself that those expensive suits must have cost a fortune, and yet not one of them could be bothered to pick up even a single scrap of paper. She pulled on her rubber gloves and began wiping down the long, polished table, one ear still holding the earbud that played the old music she always listened to so she could forget the ache in her back. When she leaned forward to clean the corner of the table near the wide glass wall where the presentation screen was mounted, her eyes accidentally drifted over the numbers still lingering there, and her hand stopped halfway through the motion. Something wasn't right. She hadn't meant to look. She had only meant to finish cleaning and go home to Mrs. Ruth, but the part of her mind that had been asleep for years suddenly stirred awake. The part that had once spent long hours in forensic accounting lecture halls before life forced her to leave it all unfinished. She stepped closer to the screen, tilted her head, and let her gaze move slowly along each line of transactions, as though she were reading a story whose author had deliberately hidden the ending. The spreadsheet was a maze of port expenses, shipping invoices, storage fees, loading charges, all tangled and cluttered enough to make anyone dizzy and give up. But Delia wasn't looking at each number by itself. She was looking at their rhythm, and it was that rhythm that betrayed them. She murmured that they were trying to make everything look more complicated than it really was, just like someone pouring 3 kinds of chemicals onto the floor when a damp rag would have been enough. There was a series of invoices for the same doc, the same vendor, repeating again and again at intervals so regular they were unnatural, each time with an amount a little too round, a little too perfect, and after every 3-week cycle, a sum of money slipped quietly out through an identifier that no reconciliation line ever touched. An ordinary person would have seen it as operating cost. A good accountant would have seen it as an error. But Delia, with eyes long used to searching for the things people tried to bury on purpose, immediately saw it for what it was, a ghost stream of money woven carefully enough to flow steadily out of the books, without anyone noticing. She stood still for a moment, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Then, almost by instinct, she picked up a red marker someone had left behind on the table, walked over, circled 3 invoice entries spaced with perfect regularity, connected them with a single line, then wrote a short note underneath, pointing out where the money had truly disappeared and, more important than anything else, who had the authority to touch that identifier in the first place. The whole thing happened in less than a minute, so quickly that even she startled herself when she stepped back and looked at what she had done, as though she had accidentally done something that didn't belong to her. She gave a faint, crooked smile, shook her head, and told herself that those geniuses were probably so busy trying to look smart that they'd forgotten how to look carefully. Then she turned to take hold of the mop again, her heart feeling strangely light because she thought no one knew, no one cared, and she would get home on time. But the very moment her fingers touched the mop handle, a deep voice, cold and flat enough to make her skin prickle, rose from the darkness near the doorway and asked what the hell she had just done. And Delia suddenly realized that this room, from the very beginning, had never truly been empty. The man stepped out of the darkness near the doorway slowly, without hurry, as though this entire building and everything inside it belonged to him, and he had the whole night to watch. He was tall, dressed in a tailored black suit that fit close over his broad shoulders, his face sharp and cold without a single ripple of emotion, and his dark eyes studied her the way a person might study an odd number that shouldn't exist on a balance sheet. Julian Thorne repeated his question in a voice even softer than the first time, asking what she had just done to his screen. And Delia, already too exhausted after her shift, and having no idea who the man in front of her was beyond some rich man awake at an unusually late hour, only shrugged and answered that she cleaned. That was her job, while the mess on that board belonged to the people in suits, and if he wanted to blame someone, he should blame whoever left it there. One corner of Julian's mouth moved slightly, not a smile, but the rare surprise of a man who had gone too long without hearing anyone speak to him in a voice untouched by fear. He took several more steps into the room, his gaze leaving her and coming to rest on the 3 red circles and the brief line she had written beneath them. And for one very brief moment, the stillness on his face cracked in a way almost too faint to notice. Almost at the same time, 2 other shadows appeared behind him. One was an older man with neatly combed salt and pepper hair, and the sharp eyes of someone who had lived long enough in this world to know when silence was wiser. That was Sal Renzo. Beside him stood a larger man, colder, his hand already resting loosely inside his coat, where the shape of a gun bulged beneath the fabric. That was Holloway. The air in the room thickened, a heavy silence that even Delia, though she didn't yet understand the full shape of what was happening, began to feel creeping down her spine inch by inch. Sal moved closer to the screen, glanced at the red circles, then turned to Julian and said quietly that she had seen it. Seen what 15 people were being paid to solve, and still couldn't solve, and that sentence carried a weight Delia couldn't yet measure, because in the world of these men there was a cruel and unwritten rule, cold as a blade, that anyone from the outside who accidentally saw those numbers wasn't allowed to walk out of that room whole. Holloway shifted, his fingers tightening lightly around the grip of the gun, his eyes asking for a nod, and Sal murmured that, by custom, there was only one way to handle this. Delia looked at the hand hidden inside the large man's coat, then at Sal, then straight at Julian, and though some part of her was beginning to understand that she had just stepped into a very wrong place, she still lifted her chin and asked whether they were planning to shoot someone for wiping a table too thoroughly, because if that was the case, she was afraid the whole city was about to run out of cleaners. The words fell into the deathly silence, making Sal's brows draw together slightly, while Holloway froze for a beat. No one in that room was used to a person who might be about to die still daring to joke, and Julian Thorne, who hadn't taken his eyes off her from the beginning, slowly tilted his head to one side, studying the woman in the gray uniform as though for the first time in many years he had encountered something he couldn't immediately sort into its proper drawer, a variable he didn't yet know how to handle, and it was that exceedingly rare hesitation of his that kept Holloway's gun resting quietly in its holster for a few more fateful seconds. Julian Thorne held that gaze for a long while, so long that the whole room seemed to hold its breath and wait, his dark eyes moving from the 3 red circles on the screen back to the face of the woman standing there with a mop in her hand and her chin still lifted in stubborn defiance. Then he did something no one in that room had expected. He raised one hand slightly, only a small gesture, but it was enough to make Holloway stop at once and loosen the fingers that had been tightening around the grip of his gun. Sal Renzo snapped his head toward his boss, shock flickering across a face that had long ago learned how to hide every emotion, because in all the years he had stood beside Julian, he had never seen this man hesitate before an exposed threat, never seen him choose any path other than the coldest and most decisive one. Julian stepped closer to the screen once more, standing across from the red words Delia had written, silently reading them again and again, as if he needed to make certain that what he was seeing was real. Then, without turning his head, he spoke in a low, flat voice and ordered that no one was to touch her, that she would be taken home safely tonight, and that tomorrow morning she would return to this building, whole, breathing, and unharmed. The words fell into the room like a stone thrown onto the surface of a frozen lake. Sal opened his mouth as if to say something about rules, about what should have happened to anyone who had accidentally seen what they weren't supposed to see, but Julian only glanced at him once, a brief look sharp enough to cut off every objection before it could take shape. Holloway stood rooted to the floor, his eyes shifting from his boss to the woman, and then back to his boss again, his face carrying the confusion of a man who had spent his whole life obeying clear orders. And this time, the order went against everything he had ever been taught. Delia, standing in the middle of a tightening storm she still only dimly understood, looked at the man who had just decided her fate with a few terse sentences, and though something inside her had both clenched and loosened at once, she didn't let it show. She only asked quietly whether this was how he thanked someone for cleaning up his mess. And this time, for the first time, something very close to amusement moved through the depths of Julian's eyes, though his face itself didn't change at all. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he turned to Sal and gave a brief instruction that this woman was now under his protection, that no one was allowed to touch her without his order, and that everything related to the numbers on that screen had to remain absolutely sealed inside the walls of this room. Sal lowered his head and accepted the order, though his eyes were still full of unanswered questions, while Holloway silently stepped forward and motioned for Delia to follow. And when she leaned the mop against the side of the cart and looked back one last time at the screen with the 3 red circles that had now become the thing deciding the course of her life, she caught Julian Thorne still standing, motionless, in the middle of the room, his eyes following her without once looking away. She couldn't know that behind that absolute coldness, the most powerful man in the shadows of this entire city had just made a decision even he couldn't yet explain, a decision neither he nor she yet understood, would pull them both into a chain of events from which there would be no turning back. The glossy black car dropped Delia off in front of an aging apartment building on the southern edge of the city, where the yellow streetlights flickered weakly between brightness and shadow, and the smell of damp mold rose from the cracked concrete steps. When the luxury car door closed behind her, she stood still for a moment in the night cold, feeling as though she had just stepped out of some strange dream and back into the painfully familiar reality of her own life. She climbed 4 flights of stairs, because the elevator had been broken since last winter, and the landlord still hadn't bothered to fix it, slid her key into the rusted lock, and pushed the thin door open into the cramped apartment of only a few hundred square feet, where the small nightlight in the living room was still on, and in the armchair with its worn fabric, Mrs. Ruth sat wide awake, her eyes fixed on the door with the confused look of someone who was no longer certain where she was. She stared at Delia for a long while, then softly asked who she was and why she had come into her house at this hour. And Delia, though it felt as if someone had squeezed her heart in a fist, gently walked over, knelt beside the chair, took Tommy's mother's thin, cold hand in hers, and said softly that it was Delia, Tommy's wife, that she was home now, and asked whether she had been able to sleep. The moment Tommy's name left her lips, Mrs. Ruth's face softened for one fragile instant. She smiled and called her son's name as though he were still somewhere nearby, asking why the boy hadn't come home for dinner yet, and Delia could only lower her head and hold the old woman's hand a little tighter, not brave enough to tell her again the truth that Tommy was gone, that she had already had to say those words more times than she could count over the past 14 months, and every time it tore open a wound that had only just begun to close. She helped Mrs. Ruth into bed, pulled the blanket up to her shoulders, and sat beside her, humming an old melody under her breath until the older woman's breathing became steady again. Then she quietly stepped back out and sat down at the wobbly dining table, where white envelopes were piled so high she no longer dared to open them. But she opened them anyway, one by one, under the yellow light. Tommy's hospital bills from those final months when she had sold almost everything that could be sold just to hold on to him. Debt notices printed in heavy red ink. The number on the bottom line so large she had once thought a lifetime of mopping floors still wouldn't be enough to pay it. And beneath them all was the letter from the nursing home where she was trying to keep a place for Mrs. Ruth in case she no longer had the strength to care for her alone. She pressed her face into her calloused hands and drew in a deep breath, refusing to let herself cry because she knew tears didn't pay a single bill. And in the stillness of the late night, the memory of Tommy suddenly came flooding back, the image of him coming home in his stained electrician's clothes with that tired but warm smile, promising that everything would be all right, that he would take care of it, a promise fate had never given him the chance to keep. That night, Delia couldn't sleep. She lay on the stiff couch in the living room, eyes wide open as she stared at the water stain on the ceiling, her mind spinning between the 3 red circles on the screen on the 40th floor, the cold and unreadable gaze of the man named Julian Thorne, and the strange order that forced her to return to that place in the morning. And the more she thought about it, the more clearly she understood that no matter how frightened she was, no matter how darkly her instincts warned her, she still didn't have another road to choose, because behind her stood an elderly woman who needed care and a mountain of debt that never stopped growing. At exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, just as Delia had finished feeding Mrs. Ruth breakfast and sent her over to the kind neighbor who watched her every day, the familiar black car was already waiting at the foot of the apartment building, and Holloway stood beside the door with an expressionless face, waiting for her to come down without a single word of explanation, as though her being there were something so obvious it needed no discussion. This time, the car didn't take her to the office tower, but slipped through more elegant streets before stopping in front of a mansion hidden behind high walls and a black iron fence, and she was led through cold marble corridors into a spacious study where Julian Thorne was already seated behind a dark wood desk, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, a steaming cup of coffee set beside him, his dark eyes lifting to watch her step inside with the same unreadable calm he had worn the night before. He invited her to sit with a brief gesture, then went straight to the point, telling her a bare and brutal truth, that what she had seen last night was the kind of thing people were willing to kill to keep quiet, that under ordinary rules she wouldn't still be sitting here at all, and that the only reason she was still breathing was because she was useful, because in less than a minute she had done what an entire team of well-paid people couldn't manage to do. He said someone had been draining his money flow in a sophisticated way, systematically over a long period, and he needed someone who could track that person down, someone who didn't belong to this world and therefore couldn't be bought by old loyalties. And she was that person. Then he laid the price of the choice on the table in a voice so flat it made the blood run cold, saying that if she agreed to work for him and found the traitor, he would make sure her life was safe and, more important, that her elderly mother-in-law would be safe as well. He spoke each word clearly so she would understand that he knew about her husband's mother, knew about the apartment, knew about the red-stamped bills piled on her dining table, and it was the fact that he knew every detail of her small world that sent an icy chill down Delia's spine. But instead of lowering her head, instead of trembling with gratitude the way he must have been used to seeing from others, Delia sat up straight, looked directly into the dark eyes of the most powerful man in the room, and said she didn't like the way he had turned her mother's life into a chess piece on the board, that if he truly needed her mind, then he would have to treat her like a human being, not an object being forced into service. She set her own terms in return, her voice not shaking at all, saying she would do it, but she wanted Mrs. Ruth moved into the decent nursing home, where she had struggled for so long to hold a place, cared for properly no matter how this ended, and she wanted his promise that when everything was finished, she would be free to walk away without having to look over her shoulder every night. For a moment, the study sank into silence. Holloway, standing by the door, glanced toward his boss, waiting for an angry reaction to such audacity. But Julian Thorne only leaned back in his chair, his head tilting slightly to one side, his eyes studying the woman before him with a new kind of attention, as though he were reconsidering every assumption he had first made about her. Then the corner of his mouth moved faintly into something almost like a smile, and he said he accepted that it had been a very long time since someone had dared sit across from him and bargain instead of beg. And in the moment, they shook hands across that dark wood desk. Neither of them realized that the agreement they had just sealed would not only bind their fates together, but also open a door leading to truths they would both one day wish they had never dug up. As soon as the agreement was sealed, Delia was led deeper into the heart of the Thorne mansion, a world of which she had only glimpsed the outer shell, where long corridors were hung with dark oil paintings, where servants moved silently like shadows, and where every closing door carried the feeling that secrets had been buried behind it. It was in the large office in the east wing of the mansion that she first came face to face with the people who would surround her in the days ahead. The first was Margot Thorne, Julian's aunt, a woman over 60, with platinum hair swept into a perfect high bun, an expensive outfit cut with razor-sharp elegance, and cold gray eyes that swept over Delia from head to toe in a single brief look, yet long enough for Delia to feel the full weight of the contempt hidden beneath that polished courtesy. Margot didn't say anything openly rude. She only lifted one eyebrow slightly when Julian introduced Delia as the person who would help review the books, then turned to her nephew and said, in a voice light as air yet cold as steel, that she couldn't understand why something so important would be placed in the hands of someone who had been mopping floors in the hallway only yesterday, that there were doors in this house that shouldn't be open to strangers. And as she said it, her eyes never left Delia for even a second, as if she wanted Delia to understand clearly that she wasn't welcome. Julian answered his aunt with only one brief sentence, saying the decision had been made, and the finality in his voice made Margot close her mouth, though her suspicious gaze still clung to Delia like a silent warning that she would be watching every step she took. The second person who approached carried the complete opposite manner. It was Trevor Ashby, the corporation's chief accountant, a man around 44 with a warm smile, a neat suit, and thin-framed glasses that gave his face the trustworthy look of someone who had spent many years behind a desk. He reached out first and shook Delia's hand firmly, saying it was such a relief to finally have another fresh pair of eyes to help untangle this enormous mass of figures, that for months he had nearly lost sleep trying to find where things had gone wrong and couldn't, and that he was truly glad to have someone share that burden. Trevor's words were so smooth and warm that Delia almost believed them at once. He led her to the records room, kindly showed her where the files were kept, explained the filing system in careful detail, even made her a cup of coffee, and told her to ask him anything at all. And throughout that morning, he was the only person in the mansion who treated her with open friendliness, a friendliness she would later remember with a chill running down her spine. When she was finally able to sit alone before the stacks of records and the old computer set in the corner of the records room, Delia drew in a deep breath and began working. And the moment the numbers started spreading out before her eyes, her true self, the part that had lain buried for years, rose powerfully awake again. She didn't rush to find the wrong number. She began by rebuilding the entire flow of money, following each branch of spending the way one might follow veins through a body, noting the places where the rhythm of the transactions became strained, the expenses repeated with too much regularity, the numbers that were unnaturally round. And the deeper she dug, the more clearly she realized that whoever was behind this wasn't clumsy at all. On the contrary, he was extremely intelligent. He understood the system so well that he knew exactly where to hide his stream of money, so it would blend into thousands of other legitimate transactions. She narrowed down the first few suspicious points and quietly copied them into a private notebook she always carried with her, trusting no computer in that house, because the instincts of someone trained to detect fraud told her that in this mansion, filled with watchful eyes, the person she was hunting might very well be standing right behind her, smiling and pouring her a cup of coffee. 3 days later, after Delia had quietly built a fairly clear picture out of that chaos, Julian called a small meeting in the study to hear what she had found, and Margot Thorne was there, seated in the leather armchair by the window with the bearing of someone who had come to witness a failure already foretold, rather than to listen, her ringed hands folded across her chest, her cold gray eyes following every movement Delia made with undisguised skepticism. The moment Delia opened her notebook and began to speak, Margot cut her off in a calm but cutting voice, asking whether they truly had to sit there and listen to someone who had never worked a single day in finance, lecture them about the cash flow of an empire that had existed for decades, saying she had seen too many self-proclaimed geniuses come and go, and she didn't believe that one lucky moment in the night could turn a cleaning woman into an expert. Delia lifted her eyes and looked straight at the woman, entirely unshaken, and instead of arguing with words, she did what she did best. She placed the notebook on the table and began peeling back the layers one by one. She showed the entire room a chain of invoices paid to the same water transport company, sums that looked perfectly reasonable at first glance, but when placed side by side along a timeline, revealed a pattern no real business operation should have, because real money always fluctuated with seasons, with markets, with unpredictable shifts, while these numbers were too steady, too smooth, so unnaturally clean that they could only be the product of a human hand deliberately shaping them. She turned to the second layer and pointed out how those funds, after leaving the main account, had been split into smaller pieces and moved through a chain of fragile intermediary companies that existed more on paper than in reality, each transfer shaving off a small portion discreetly enough that no one would notice. But over many months, those small pieces had gathered into an enormous sum. Then she placed her finger on the final point where that stream of money vanished into an identifier only a very small number of people inside the corporation had the authority to access. The room fell silent. Margot was no longer sitting with her arms folded. She leaned forward, staring hard at the pages of the notebook. Her lips pressed tight, and for the first time, the contempt in her eyes gave way to something almost like caution, because she understood that what this woman had just exposed wasn't luck. It was the work of an eye trained to see through the most delicate layers of disguise. Sal Renzo, who had stood silently beside Julian the entire time, was the one who broke the silence. He stepped closer to the table, bent down to examine Delia's notes carefully, then lifted his head and looked at her with an expression entirely different from the one he had worn on the first day. He said quietly that he had worked in this world for nearly 30 years and had seen many sharp minds, but the way she had traced the vein of money from invoices that looked harmless was something he had rarely seen, and that rare acknowledgement from a man who usually spared his words carried a weight that made even Margot fall silent. Julian Thorne sat there watching everything, saying little, but his dark eyes followed Delia with a deeper focus than before, as if each layer of numbers she stripped away was not only exposing the traitor hidden somewhere inside his empire, but also slowly revealing a person he had underestimated from the very beginning. And when the meeting ended, as Delia gathered her notebook and walked out of the study, she didn't see Margot's gaze lingering on her back for a long while. A gaze that was no longer simple contempt, but was now mixed with the wariness of someone who had just realized that the person she had looked down on might be far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. That night, when the entire mansion had fallen into silence, and most of the servants had withdrawn to their rooms, Delia was still sitting in the records room with a stack of files, and as she passed the study on her way to find a glass of water, she caught sight of the door left slightly open, with only a single desk lamp burning inside, its yellow light falling across the figure of Julian Thorne sitting alone beside the large window, an untouched glass of liquor in his hand, his eyes fixed on the dark courtyard beyond, with an emptiness he always kept hidden in daylight behind his cold mask. She stood still at the threshold for a moment, witnessing a sight perhaps no one in this empire had ever been allowed to see: the most powerful man in the city's shadows sitting there in absolute loneliness, his shoulders sinking slightly beneath the weight of something she couldn't name, and she should have quietly turned away, but instead, she tapped lightly on the doorframe and asked whether the liquor was so good that a person had to drink it in the dark. Julian didn't startle. He only turned his head slowly, and for a brief instant she thought he was going to order her out, but he merely looked at her and answered quietly that darkness made everything more honest, because in daylight people had to wear too many faces. Delia stepped inside without asking permission, pulled out a chair, and sat at a careful distance from him, saying she understood what it felt like to wear a face all day, because she had been smiling at the whole world ever since her world fell apart while breaking down inside. The words came out so naturally that even she was surprised, and Julian turned to look at her longer this time, his gaze no longer the look of a man assessing a variable, but the look of someone who had just realized that the person before him was carrying a wound like his own. They sat there talking in the dim yellow light, at first still trading the sharp, cold remarks that had become familiar between them. She teased that a man as rich as he was somehow still couldn't hire someone to keep him company at midnight, and he replied that money could buy many things, but it had never bought him a person who didn't lie to him. And that sentence, spoken almost like a joke, revealed a very small crack in the ice surrounding him. Delia was silent for a while, then said softly that it must be exhausting not to be able to trust anyone, to have to suspect even the shadows around him, and Julian didn't answer right away. He turned the glass of liquor slowly in his hand, his eyes drifting back toward the window, then answered in a low voice that there were prices a person had to pay for sitting where he sat, that the people he had trusted most had all taught him the same lesson, that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. And through that deep voice, past the trace of an old pain, he immediately forced back down, saying nothing more about it, leaving only a heavy silence in the air that made Delia understand there were wounds he had buried too deeply to be touched in a single night. She didn't press him. She simply sat there with him in silence, and that wordless, unjudging silence said more than any comfort ever could, until she finally stood and said it was late and she should rest. Then she paused at the threshold, turned back to look at him one last time, and said softly that sometimes drinking with another person was less lonely than drinking alone in the dark. And after she had disappeared from sight, Julian Thorne remained seated there for a long time, the glass of liquor still untouched in his hand. But for the first time in many years, the silence around him no longer felt as suffocating as before, and he realized with a flicker of unease that he was waiting to hear that woman's footsteps return. In the days that followed, Delia sank deeper and deeper into the maze of the Thorne Corporation's records, and when she traced one of the most suspicious spending branches all the way back to its roots, she was forced to dig into old files stored from more than a year earlier, dust-covered documents that no one seemed to have bothered reopening for a very long time. And it was while she was turning through a stack of papers recording payments to subcontractors and maintenance services that her eyes accidentally passed over a name that made her whole body freeze for an instant. It was the name of a small technical services company, a name she had once heard Tommy mention somewhere during old dinners, a name tied to the days when he had taken extra after-hours work to try to make ends meet. And she sat there staring at that line of text with a vague uneasiness crawling down her spine, not understanding why a seemingly harmless name could make her heart beat faster. She told herself it was probably only a coincidence, that this city had hundreds of small technical companies with names that sounded alike, that her mind was simply exhausted and kept seeing Tommy's shadow in things that had nothing to do with him. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself, that uneasy ripple inside her refused to settle. She followed the file code attached to that name, trying to see which project the payment belonged to and who had approved it. But strangely enough, most of the related details had either been left blank or marked with archive symbols she had never seen in any other records, as though someone had deliberately blurred its trail. And the more she tried to follow it, the more she ran into walls, dead ends, and missing pages pulled away without explanation. One part of her, the cold and rational forensic accountant, told her that this kind of deliberate absence of information was always the sign of something someone wanted hidden. But another part of her, the part of a wife whose grief had never truly quieted, trembled before the possibility that this name might touch a place she wasn't ready to touch. She closed the file, drew in a deep breath, and reminded herself that her job was to find the person currently draining the money flow, not to dig through buried records from the previous year, that she shouldn't let personal emotion pull her off the path. But even after she had put the file back on the shelf, she still secretly copied that name and the file code onto the final page of her private notebook, in a corner separated from her other investigation notes, as if some instinct was telling her that one day she would need it. That night, back at the apartment, as she sat beside Mrs. Ruth's bed while the older woman slept, she took out the notebook and stared at that line for a long time beneath the glow of the nightlight, her heart heavy with a nameless dread. And she quietly wondered whether she was imagining a connection that didn't exist, or whether there was some thin thread she hadn't yet seen, quietly linking her dead husband to the very world that had just pulled her in, and she couldn't have known that the vague instinct she felt that night was the first clue to a truth that, once fully exposed, would shatter everything she believed. Setting aside the vague uneasiness about that old name, Delia turned her full mind back to the main task. And over the following days she worked with an almost sleepless intensity, tracing every dollar that flowed out of the main account through the identifier she had marked off on that very first night, patiently loosening each knot the way someone might untangle a spool of thread. She discovered that after the money left the corporation, it didn't disappear at once, but was moved through a network of intermediary companies that had been built with great care. Each company had proper paperwork, an address, a listed representative. But when she dug deeper, she realized they were all hollow shells, with no employees, no real operations, existing only to pass money from one hand to another, before quietly dissolving after a few months and being replaced by new shells. She spent 2 straight nights reconstructing the entire chain of transfers across sheets of paper spread over the record's room table, connecting one company to the next with lines of ink, and little by little, a shape began to emerge. All the branches of money that had seemed scattered everywhere finally gathered at the same destination. An overseas account disguised under the name of an investment fund that sounded respectable, but in truth was only the final coat of paint laid over a dirty stream of money. When she traced backward to see who had both the authority and the knowledge of the system to operate such a refined machine, Delia began narrowing the list, because not everyone inside the corporation could touch that original identifier, and the more names she eliminated, the more the path led in a direction that made even her go still. The only person who had access, and who also knew every hidden corner of the accounting system well enough to conceal the money flow so perfectly, was none other than Trevor Ashby. She sat in silence for a long time before that discovery, refusing to believe it right away, because Trevor was the only person in the mansion who had treated her kindly from the first day, the one who had made her coffee, who had guided her with such care, and the reasoning mind of an investigator warned her that this very excess of kindness was the most suspicious thing of all, that the smartest culprit was always the one standing closest to the light, so no one would think he was hiding in the dark. To be certain, she quietly compared the times when money had been withdrawn with the system access logs, and each piece clicked into place in a way that chilled her blood. Every time a sum slipped out, there had always been a login from Trevor's account, a few hours earlier, into the exact subsystem that held that identifier, a coincidence repeated far too many times to be coincidence at all. But what truly made her heart go cold was when she traced the final destination of the money and discovered that the overseas investment fund had discreet ties to a name even she, an outsider, had heard whispered around the mansion. The Vance family, the rival house Julian was preparing to enter into tense negotiations with. Delia understood at once the terrible meaning of what she had just found. Trevor wasn't simply a greedy man systematically siphoning off a fortune from his boss. He was betraying an entire empire, siphoning off money while also feeding vital information to Julian's most dangerous enemy. And if the coming negotiations took place while the Vance family already held every card because of this mole, the consequence wouldn't only be lost money, it would be a bloodbath. She closed the notebook, her hands trembling slightly, knowing she had just touched something far more dangerous than anything she had imagined when she signed that agreement, and knowing that the moment she spoke Trevor Ashby's name aloud, there would be no road back for anyone. That night, unable to sleep after having reached the name Trevor Ashby, Delia pulled out her notebook again, and her eyes accidentally came to rest on the corner of the final page, where she had copied the name of the small technical services company, along with the suspicious file code from the days before, the name tied to Tommy that she had tried to push aside. And this time, with everything she had just discovered about the way Trevor hid his tracks, a chilling thought suddenly flashed through her mind, that perhaps those blurred files hadn't been blurred by accident. She returned to the mansion the very next morning, quietly dug up that same old dust-covered file, and this time she wasn't looking for the money trail, but for the file code itself that had been left blank, patiently following the strange archive symbols she had once stumbled over, comparing them with the internal marking system she had gradually come to understand after many days of work, and little by little, the disguise began to peel away, exposing what lay beneath. The small technical services company Tommy had once worked for on the side turned out to be a subcontractor hired to maintain the system at one of the facilities under the Thorne Corporation's control, and during the brief period he worked there, the records noted an incident classified simply as a workplace accident. A death closed quickly, neatly, with no deeper investigation, no one asking questions, and the date written there caught Delia's breath halfway in her throat, because it was exactly the day 14 months ago that she still remembered by every hour and every minute, the day someone had knocked on the door of her small apartment to tell her that her husband was gone. But what began to collapse her whole world wasn't that date. It was what she found when she fitted it together with everything else, because hidden among the blurred files were traces of access attempts someone had tried to erase, and when she followed them with the very skills that had helped her expose the dirty money flow, she discovered that only a few days before Tommy died, he had accidentally been assigned to maintain the exact storage system where the first books of the siphoning operation had been hidden, the very system Trevor Ashby was using to conceal his crimes, and the scattered notes still left behind showed that an irregular report had been sent from that very facility just before every trace was wiped clean. Delia sat frozen in the records room, her trembling hands resting on the pages, and the terrible truth slowly took shape before her eyes with merciless clarity. Tommy hadn't died in an accident. He had seen something he was never supposed to see. He had accidentally touched the filthy secret of the traitor, and his death, the one she had spent the past 14 months believing was a random tragedy of fate, had in truth been an act of silencing, staged with cold and perfect precision to bury the truth along with the man who had happened to glimpse it. She clapped a hand over her mouth to keep from sobbing aloud, her whole body turning icy cold and then burning hot, the tears she had forced herself to hold back for all those months now spilling out beyond control, and in that dizziness, thousands of broken pieces of memory rushed back. Tommy's tired smile in those final days, his words that there was something wrong with this new job but he couldn't tell her yet, the flicker of worry in his eyes that she hadn't paid attention to then, all of it now carrying an entirely different meaning, painful and horrifying. She folded over the files, her tears falling and blurring several lines of ink, and in the middle of that heart-tearing pain, another emotion began to kindle, cold and sharp, because she realized that the world she had just stepped into, the empire she was now serving, was the very place that had taken from her the man she loved most, and the person who had done it was still walking calmly through this mansion, smiling at her every day. But she forced herself to swallow the storm screaming inside her, hurriedly wiped away her tears, and hid everything, because her survival instinct told her this wasn't yet the moment to let anyone know what she had just discovered. But Delia couldn't hide the storm inside her forever, And that night she went to the study where Julian often sat alone, pushed the door open without knocking, her face still marked by tears that hadn't had time to dry. And when he looked up at her with a brief flash of surprise, she set the old file directly on the desk in front of him, her voice shaking from the effort of holding herself together, asking whether he knew anything about the death that had happened at one of his facilities 14 months ago, asking whether he knew who a man named Tommy Hale was. Julian looked at the name on the file, then back at her tear-soaked face, and for a moment she saw the familiar calm on his face crack. He asked quietly, in a low voice, whether Tommy Hale was her husband, and when she nodded through her tears, something heavy passed through those dark eyes. She didn't give him time to evade her. She poured everything out. That her husband hadn't died because of an accident, but because he had seen something he was never supposed to see. That the very empire Julian ruled had taken him from her, had made her a widow, had driven her into months of mopping floors to pay the debts left behind by a death she now knew had been murder. And through her sobs, she asked whether he had been the one who gave that order, whether the hands of the man sitting across from her were stained with the blood of the man she loved. Julian Thorne, the man who had never bowed his head before anyone, didn't hide behind his familiar cold mask this time. He rose slowly, and instead of denying it or defending himself, he looked straight into her eyes and admitted that he hadn't known about Tommy's death until this very moment, that he hadn't given that order, but that he also wasn't cowardly enough to hide from the truth that it had happened under his roof, inside the empire that carried his name. And because of that, he couldn't deny responsibility, even if his own hands hadn't directly caused it. Then, for the first time since she had known him, Julian let the ice around him begin to melt. He sat down and told her in a rough, low voice about the world that had made him who he was, about his father being assassinated right in front of him when he was still too young to bear it, about being forced to take on an entire blood-stained empire before he had even had time to become a grown man, about the younger brother he had loved and trusted most, betraying him in a bid for power, and then dying inside the very scheme he had created, and about how after all those losses, he had taught himself that the only way to survive was never to trust anyone, never to let anyone come close enough. He said he had done things that made it impossible for him to call himself a good man, that his hands were stained with blood in many ways, and that he wouldn't insult her pain by pretending he was innocent. But he swore that Tommy's death hadn't been his order, and that the person truly behind it was also the person betraying him now. Delia stood there, tears still falling, torn between her fury at the entire world that had killed her husband and the painful truth that the man in front of her, the one she should have hated, was being more nakedly honest with her than anyone had ever been, and she realized that her grief and his loneliness, though different, had both been born from the same darkness. She didn't forgive him that night. She couldn't, but she didn't turn her back and leave either. She only sank into the chair across from him, and the two of them sat in silence in the dark room, two wounds bleeding side by side in the dim yellow light, and in that moment of deepest hurt, a quiet and painful understanding came into being between them, something no words could name. But the darkness they had just revealed to each other gave them no quiet space in which to heal, because Trevor Ashby, with the keen instinct of a man who had survived for years through cunning, had already begun to sense that something was closing in around him. He noticed that the woman who had once cleaned floors was now spending too much time in the records room, digging through files no one was supposed to look at anymore, and he realized that the way she looked at him had changed. It no longer held the naive trust of those first days, but instead carried a carefully hidden wariness. He didn't wait to be driven into a corner. He immediately activated the plan he had been quietly preparing for a long time, secretly contacting the Vance family to warn them that his cover was about to be exposed, and that the time had come to strike the decisive blow. Together, they built a perfect trap aimed straight at the coming ceasefire negotiation between the two families, the meeting Julian believed would help prevent a bloody war, but which had in truth been turned into a carefully laid ambush, where Desmond Vance would walk in with every card in his hand, and Julian would walk in without knowing that every move of his had already been sold out in advance. But Trevor understood that the most dangerous link now wasn't Julian. It was Delia herself, the only person who had traced the truth and could destroy the entire plan with only a few words. And so he decided to strike first, aiming at the one weakness he knew she couldn't withstand. That afternoon, when Delia returned to the apartment after a long day, she stepped inside and instantly felt that something terrible had happened. The kind neighbor's door was wide open. Her own apartment was cold and empty. The armchair where Mrs. Ruth always sat now held no one, and on the dining table, placed neatly beside the familiar stack of bills, was a strange phone blinking. Delia's heart clenched. She picked it up with trembling hands, and the voice that came through the other end was smooth and cold enough to make her skin crawl, a voice she recognized at once, even though it had completely shed the warm mask she knew. It was Trevor. He spoke to her with the calm tone of a man certain he had already won, telling her that Mrs. Ruth was somewhere safe, at least for now, that the old woman's fate was now entirely in Delia's hands, and that if she wanted to see her again, she had to do one thing, and one thing only. She had to remain absolutely silent about everything she had found. Not one word to Julian, not one word to anyone, and she had to let tomorrow's negotiation unfold exactly as it was meant to unfold. He added that she was an intelligent woman, so he trusted she understood the price of making the wrong choice, that he had watched her long enough to know Mrs. Ruth was all she had left in the world, and that as long as she behaved, no one needed to get hurt. But if she was foolish enough to resist or ask for help, then she would spend the rest of her life knowing that her own stubbornness had killed the only person who still loved her. The line cut off abruptly, leaving Delia standing frozen in the empty apartment with the cold phone trembling in her hand, the whole world seeming to collapse around her because she was trapped between two choices, and either one could get someone killed. On one side was the only elderly mother she had left in her life, now in the hands of the man who had murdered her husband. On the other was the man she had only just begun to understand, walking straight into a deadly trap that only she could warn him about. And time was running out, second by second, before the dawn of that fateful day began to rise. Standing in the empty apartment with the phone still warm in her hand, Delia hadn't even had time to steady herself when the screen lit up once more. And this time, when she pressed the phone to her ear, Trevor's voice came through more slowly, carrying the cruel pleasure of a man who had waited too long to finally reveal the truth. He said that before she did anything foolish, there was something he thought she deserved to know, something that would help her understand her true place in this entire story. He asked whether she had ever wondered why a widow who had just lost her husband, buried in debt, had been lucky enough to get hired for the exact night shift janitor position in the very building of the Thorn Corporation, whether she had ever found it strange that everything had come to her so easily at the moment she was most desperate. And when Delia stood frozen and didn't answer, he spoke the truth himself, a truth that made the ground seem to collapse beneath her feet. He said he was the one who had placed her there about 10 months ago, that nothing had been coincidence. He explained in a voice terrifyingly calm that after Tommy died, he had never truly felt at ease. He needed to know whether the wife of that unlucky electrician knew anything about what her husband had seen, whether Tommy had managed to bring that secret home and tell her, and the safest way to watch her wasn't to kill another person and draw attention, but to pull her closer, to place her somewhere he could observe her every day, to turn her into a harmless pawn, kept directly within his sight. He said that during all those months, he had been satisfied to see that she was only an exhausted woman trying to pay debts and care for her mother-in-law, knowing nothing at all, and he had intended to let her remain quietly that way forever, until that fateful night, when she picked up a red marker and circled the very thing he had hidden so carefully for so long, turning herself from a harmless pawn into his greatest threat in less than a minute. He scoffed over the phone, admitting he had underestimated her background, foolishly assuming that because she dropped out of college years ago and was buried in debts, she had forgotten every bit of her forensic accounting knowledge and would remain a harmless cleaning woman forever. Every word he spoke twisted into Delia's heart like a knife, because she realized that the whole of the past 10 months, every day, she had scrubbed floors in despair. Every night she had believed she had at least managed to hold on to one last bit of luck in the middle of her suffering, had all been part of the cold arrangement of the man who had killed her husband, that she had never truly escaped his shadow, that even her grief and her meager survival had been turned by him into a piece on his board. He ended by reminding her that now she understood just how deeply he controlled her life, that he had held her fate in his hands long before she ever realized it, and therefore she shouldn't delude herself into thinking she could defeat him. Her best choice was to stay obediently silent and keep Mrs. Ruth alive. When the line cut off again, Delia stood there trembling, but in the midst of that shock and absolute humiliation, something inside her began to change, because the pain of realizing she had been manipulated for so long slowly transformed into a cold, hard clarity. She understood that Trevor had made a fatal mistake by revealing everything simply to satisfy his own sense of triumph, because now she had nothing left to lose and fully understood her enemy. and the very woman he had dismissed as a harmless pawn, with the mind that had once decoded what 15 experts couldn't solve, wouldn't sit still and wait for him to decide her fate one more time. Instead of obediently staying silent as Trevor had ordered, Delia did the one thing he hadn't anticipated at all. She went to Julian that very night and told him everything, from the ambush planned for the ceasefire meeting to the fact that Mrs. Ruth had been kidnapped to force her silence. And as she spoke, she looked straight into his eyes, knowing she was placing her mother-in-law's life on a gamble, but also believing this was the only move left. Julian Thorne, the man who had always placed the survival of his empire above all else, now stood before the greatest choice of his life, and for the first time, he chose a human being over power. He told her in a low, firm voice that they would save Mrs. Ruth first, that no negotiation, no empire, was worth trading for her life. And in that moment, Delia saw in him a man entirely different from the cold figure she had met on the first night. But instead of charging into the kind of bloody shootout Trevor was expecting, Delia proposed a plan that used the very weapon she understood best. She said Trevor's true strength didn't lie in guns, but in the money flow and in the fragile trust between him and the Vance family, and if they could break those two things, he would collapse on his own. Through that night, with Sal's support and the access Julian gave her, Delia sat before the screen and began dismantling the entire financial machine Trevor had spent so long building. One by one, she froze each shell account in the transfer chain, locked the identifier he had been using to siphon money, and cut off every path for the dirty money, paralyzing the hidden empire he had built inside Julian's own empire in only a few hours. But her decisive blow wasn't freezing the money. It was exposing the truth to the Vance family themselves, because she had gathered enough evidence to show that Trevor had never been loyal to Desmond Vance the way he claimed. All this time, he had been secretly skimming and keeping for himself a large portion of the money that was supposed to belong to the arrangement between the two sides. And when that evidence was delivered to Desmond Vance through a discreet intermediary channel just before the meeting, the trust between the traitor and his ally shattered instantly. The trap Trevor had set to destroy Julian suddenly turned back and snapped shut around him, because the Vance family, once they realized they had been deceived and robbed by the very mole they had trusted, no longer had any reason to walk into the ambush. Instead, they withdrew and left Trevor alone to face the wrath of the man he had betrayed. At the same time, thanks to the clues Delia had traced from Trevor's final financial transactions, Sal and Julian's men identified the place where he was holding Mrs. Ruth, an old warehouse on the outskirts, and the rescue was carried out quickly, cleanly, and precisely. Holloway led the men in under cover of night, disabling Trevor's people before they had time to react, and when the warehouse door flew open, Delia rushed inside and wrapped her arms around her terrified but unharmed mother-in-law, tears streaming down her face. Trevor Ashby, when he realized that every one of his moves had fallen apart, his money frozen, his allies turned away, his hostage freed, tried to run in desperation, but there was no escaping the reach of the man he had betrayed, and Julian Thorne faced him in person, not with loud rage, but with the terrifying coldness of a man who had waited too long to demand justice. What happened to Trevor after that took place in darkness, decisive and merciless, closing the fate of the man who had caused so much suffering, returning the truth to Tommy's wrongful death, and ending the threat that had hung over everyone Delia loved. When the storm had finally passed and the dust had settled, a strange quietness settled over the Thorne mansion and over the lives of those who had just walked through it. Mrs. Ruth was brought back safely and later moved into the decent nursing home Delia had always hoped for, a place where she was cared for with kindness amid peaceful surroundings. And though her memory still slipped away like sand through her fingers, at least the days she had left were wrapped in gentleness instead of fear. For Delia, learning the truth about Tommy's death didn't erase the pain, but it closed a wound that had been bleeding quietly for the past 14 months, because now she no longer had to live with the tormenting question of a meaningless accident. She knew her husband had died because he was an honest man who had happened to see something wrong, and the person who had caused that death had finally paid the price, and that truth, bitter as it was, gave back to her and to Tommy a kind of justice she had once believed would never come. Julian Thorne, after everything that had happened, was the one who changed the most, because being forced to choose between an empire and a human life had made him look back at the entire world he had inherited from blood and darkness, and he began doing the one thing he had never dared imagine before. Step by step, he started dismantling the dirtiest pieces of the family's business, slowly moving money and power into legitimate fields, closing the dark doors his father and generations before him had opened. Not in one night, and not without risk, but with a determination Sal, the man who had stood beside him for so many years, had never seen in him before. But perhaps the deepest lesson the two of them learned wasn't found in deals or accounts, but in a simple truth this world so often forgets, that a person's worth is never measured by the uniform they wear or the work they do to survive, because the very woman an entire mansion had once looked at with contempt, the woman people assumed was invisible as she quietly scrubbed floors at night, was the only one who saw what the most highly paid minds had failed to see, the one who saved an entire empire and exposed the man no one had suspected for years. Julian admitted to her that all his life, he had been used to judging people by their power and their usefulness, and it wasn't until he met her that he understood that the people society considered the lowest often carried within them a dignity and intelligence those sitting above them would never possess, and that he had almost missed that extraordinary person simply because she wore a gray uniform. Margot Thorne, who had once looked at Delia with suspicion and disdain, now treated her with quiet respect. And though she wasn't the kind of woman who offered apologies easily, the way she nodded in greeting whenever she saw Delia said everything. As for Delia, she was no longer the exhausted woman who had bowed her head and mopped floors in despair through the old months of suffering. She had found again the person she had once lost, when life forced her to set her dream aside. And standing amid the ashes of tragedy, she began to see a new road opening before her, a road she wouldn't have to walk alone. About 1 year after that fateful night had brought all the darkness to an end, a clear autumn morning laid a gentle sunlight over the city of Chicago, and inside a bright building in the heart of the city, a new sign had just been hung, bearing the words The Hale Foundation, an organization Delia had founded with Julian's support, a place where she poured all her heart into teaching forensic accounting and financial skills to women who had once been crushed by life the way she had been, single mothers, widows carrying debts, people society was used to glancing past without ever seeing the hidden potential inside them. Delia stood before a small classroom filled with the faces of women of all ages, telling them that talent and dignity existed everywhere, even in the darkest places, that the only thing many of them had ever lacked was never intelligence, but simply the chance to be seen by someone for who they truly were. And as she spoke those words, her eyes shone with a light she had once believed, many months before, had gone out forever. Mrs. Ruth was still being cared for safely and warmly in the nursing home, and though most of the time she could no longer remember things clearly, there were still afternoons when she held Delia's hand, smiled, and called her daughter, small moments Delia treasured like precious jewels. As for Julian Thorne, the man who had once spent years sitting alone in the dark drinking by himself, he was no longer alone. He had nearly completed the difficult road of turning the blood-stained empire he had inherited into decent legal businesses, and more important than anything, he had learned how to trust and love another human being. Learned that true strength didn't lie in the fear he could spread, but in the gentleness he dared to offer. One afternoon, when Julian stopped by the foundation to pick Delia up, he found her standing in a corner of the classroom, holding an old mop in her hand, the very mop she had kept from years ago as a keepsake, and she turned to look at him with a mischievous smile, telling him not to forget where she had started. Because who knew? Maybe one day he would need someone who knew how to wipe a table very thoroughly to help him solve a mess of tangled numbers again. And Julian, the man who had once been able to freeze an entire room with a single look, laughed out loud, a warm and free sound that even he hadn't expected he could still possess. Then he stepped toward her and said softly that he would never forget, because it was the woman holding that mop who had cleaned away an entire life of his that he had believed could no longer be saved. The story of Delia and Julian reminds us of one simple but profound truth, that we should never judge a person's worth by their appearance or by the work they do, because behind a faded uniform, behind a pair of calloused hands, there may be an extraordinary mind, a resilient heart, and a dignity that no power or money can ever buy, and that kindness and respect for the quiet people around us can sometimes carry the power to heal and change even the destinies that seemed already closed. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so we can spread meaningful stories together, and so you won't miss the wonderful videos sent to you every day. We would truly love to hear the feelings from deep within your heart. How did this story make you feel? And what did it make you think of in your own real life? Have you ever met a quiet person whose true worth had been forgotten? Please leave a comment sharing your story and your thoughts so we can listen to one another and understand one another more deeply. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story all the way through, and may everyone watching this video always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.